Welcome everyone. In this chess video, I really wanted to have something a little bit more helpful for beginners, and especially for people who are a little bit, more intermediate range. I think this video will help a lot of people. I think it's actually more beneficial to start with the basic checkmates, the basic theoretical endgames, and then from there, you'll have some kind of idea of what kind of positions you want to aim for. So, with that being said, this video, I wanted to go over a bunch of different checkmate patterns, but not just really obscure ones, but like really common ones. That way, you're much more likely to find those in a game because you've seen them here. But okay, let's get started on that, because that's a lot to say. Okay, all of these positions are from my own games, by the way, because I just wanted to do that kind of a fun little challenge to find these. But okay, the first checkmate pattern we have here, this is called Anastasia's Mate. And so this is delivered with a rook or a queen, in this case on h3. And what makes this key is they have a friendly piece, almost always a pawn, and this is blocking their own king. And then the other two squares, these escape squares here, these are controlled by one of our knights. And so this configuration here, specifically the knight and these squares taken away, with this piece, this is what makes this checkmate. And so this pattern here is called Anastasia's checkmate. Okay, so that was simple. Let's go on to the next pattern. And the more of these that you see, the more likely you are to find these in a game. Okay, so the next pattern here we have is called Arabian Mate, and this is delivered with a knight and a rook. It's kind of surprising that you can only checkmate with two pieces, but you actually can. The knight takes away this square, and the rook controls all of this rank here, and that boxes in the king. And of course, the rook is delivering a check, the king, and so this is where this checkmate comes from. Okay, so that was Arabian checkmate. So next we have Balestra Mate. Again, we only have two pieces here. This checkmate is characterized by the queen controlling the escape squares to the king diagonally and vertically, and then the last remaining square, the one that the queen is not controlling, is delivered by the bishop. And this is a really common one, I think, to come up, even though it's very hard to try and force if you wanted to try and get this exact one. And the reason it's kind of hard to force is because the queen is actually controlling all of these squares, so you can't trap the king with the queen and then hope to move the bishop around, because there's literally no other pieces on the board. It'll be stalemate because the king would have no legal moves. So you have to make sure that this move with the bishop is delivering the checkmate right when the king is corralled like that. So okay, so that was Balestra Mate. Let's go to the next checkmate. So this one is Box Mate. Now the thing is, if you look at these, this one is Box Mate with the rook. You can do it with a queen as well. So how this is determined is when you have your king having king opposition with their king on the side of the board, and then your king is controlling these three key squares here. And so then you basically just deliver like a back rank type pattern where a rook or a queen, delivers a back rank type idea on this king. So that's the Box Mate. So next we have Boden's Mate. So Boden's Mate here is where we have a really nice configuration, these two bishops slicing down into the enemy position, and almost always they have a rook and some other minor piece here that's blocking the escape squares. Usually it's a rook because almost always that side is castled into a Boden's Mate here. And I'll go back a few moves just to show, because it's a very common idea in how you set this up. So almost always they're castled, and once they are in this position here, nearly always there's a rook or a queen sacrifice that ends up happening right in front of the king on c6. And what this does is, I sacrifice the queen in this position. This pawn is decoyed away, so they have to take here. And then we have this really nice checkmate where, very similar to Balestra's Mate with the queen, these squares are controlled, and then the bishop is the one to deliver checkmate on the far edge from that. So that was a nice checkmate with that idea there. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So the next checkmate here is called Blind Swine Mate. And so this is called that because swine, or pigs, there's kind of a funny story there. That was Janowski, famous chess player from one of the early pioneers of chess. He called that for any rook that's on the 7th, and especially, when rooks are doubled on the 7th rank. In this case, it'd be 2nd rank because it's black, but, if it was white, it could be the same thing on the, 7th rank. And you could also do the same on the side of the board, too, if it's on the B file or the G file. So this checkmate is, of course, with two rooks kind of corralling them. The common pattern here, which characterizes this checkmate, is where you have this check with the rook, they have to move, and then the other rook is delivering checkmate, and almost always there's some kind of rooks kind of bookending on this side, but you could actually do it with one rook if it was on the edge of the board. Like if there was, this rook was gone and the king and everything else was slid over to the A file here, you could have the enemy rook kind of pinning back their own king, and then our rook still bring checkmate. So this is what's known as blind swine mate, very common pattern. Okay, so the next pattern here, we have Blackburne's Mate. This one is a lot less common in the game, but it's definitely worth knowing because it comes up a relatively decent amount, even though it's rare to actually come up like to the very end. It comes up a lot in the fact that you can maybe set this up or come very close. So what happens is oftentimes they castle, their king is super exposed, you have a bishop slicing down here, you have this knight controlling the last square, and really any kind of check, would be checkmate, because all the king's escape squares are controlled. Now, Blackburne's Mate is where you have the bishop slide into the last square, and it's defended by your knight. So this is known as Blackburne's Mate. Here we have Back Rank Mate, very common one. Most people have seen this. So many times make jokes in the early chess.com, puzzle rush puzzles where there's so many back rank checkmates. This can be done with the queen or a rook. The idea is the king is stuck, usually behind their own pawns, and you just deliver this checkmate on the very back rank, and the king has no escape because they can't come up to the other squares. Next, we have Corner Mate. So Corner Mate is the pattern where their king is stuck in the corner and behind one of their friendly pawns. And so we have that here. And then with Corner Mate, it's a queen or a rook somewhere on the adjacent file here. And this is keeping the king boxed in. And so the king has no escape squares, in this case because of our rook here on g6. And so when the king has no escape squares, it's only one, check away from checkmate. And so if you deliver that check with a minor piece, in this case a bishop, but it could just as easily be a knight on, say, like f7, that is called corner mate. So corner mate, you have to have the king cut off the corner with the rook or queen, and the checkmate has to be delivered by a minor piece, which means a knight or a bishop. So okay, so that was corner mate. So next we have Damiano's Bishop Mate. So this is any time that you have a queen and bishop battery, very common, and then you deliver checkmate because the queen puts itself right in front of the enemy king, and that is checkmate because the king has no legal squares. Notice even if this rook wasn't here, this is still Damiano's Bishop Mate because the queen would also control that square. So that is that checkmate, very common one to know. Next we have Dovetail Mate. Some people also call this Cozio Mate because Cozio was a chess player who came up with a chess study. I think it was in 1766. And that study ended in this checkmate, which ends up, having his name in it. But I like the name Dovetail Mate. I think that's a little better because the idea here is the queen is controlling all these squares, right here. So it's got the sides and the diagonals covered and it's giving the check by itself, supported by a rook. But what makes this really neat is the queen cannot control these two squares here, because it's just a little bit out of its range. So when they're defended by their own friendly pieces to the king, usually it's pawns, but not always. This is called Dovetail's Mate because it's almost like the dovetails of like a dove, so kind of like the tail feathers, which is kind of a neat thing. It's kind of a, artistic, symbolic kind of thing. I like those kind of visual descriptions, but that's just me. This is called Dovetail's Mate. Let's go on to the next checkmate. So this pattern here is kind of an interesting one. This is called Epaulette's Mate, and it's called Epaulette because if you think of like the shoulder pads on a military uniform, the little ones, the little tassels, the little things on the sides, those are called epaulettes. And so here it looks like they're friendly pieces, in this case a rook. It's almost like epaulettes because they kind of look like those shoulder pieces. But in this case, the king would not want those because here it's taking away the key escape squares here. And so then you have the queen controlling these other squares while giving check, and the king has no escape squares. So this is a checkmate, and this is called Epaulette's Mate. Next we have Greco's Mate, of course from Giacomo Greco, the Italian chess player from I think the 1600s. He composed a lot of different puzzles. He had a lot of different studies. More or less just collected a bunch of chess positions and really kind of showed them off in like an instructional way. So this one is called Greco's Mate, probably because he studied around that time, where you have your bishop it has to be a bishop, I think, for this mate, but you could also do the same pattern if you had like a queen. Anything on this diagonal here, specifically the bishop for this mate, and the only purpose is to control the key square. And the reason you do that is because when they have a friendly pawn on the G or B file, you can deliver a checkmate very similar to Anastasia's mate on the very edge with a rook or a queen. And so that is Greco's mate, because, you know, this is the piece giving check. Their own pawn is unfortunately taking away this escape square for the king, and then our bishop is controlling this last square. So the king has no escape, and so that is Greco's mate. So next is kind of a surprising one, I think, for people who see it the first time, because you wouldn't think that you could deliver checkmate with so few pieces in kind of this strange configuration. Most people think that you have to get checkmated on the very edge of the board when they're first starting out, or at the very least the corner, you would think. But no, this one, you're right in the center of the board here, and this is checkmate. So this checkmate is called hookmate, and it's named that because the rook is kind of hooking around. Could be anywhere on this, you know, rank or file. And the knight is actually defending the rook. And then they have a friendly force, usually a pawn, that's controlling this one escape square that the king would love to go to. Notice the king can't go here because the knight. And all these squares are controlled by a rook. And then, of course, there's something, usually a king, but could be any pieces, you know, controlling this other square. So the king has no escape. Of course, this is checkmate. And so that was hook's mate. So we can go to the next pattern. So this one here is named killbox mate. And the idea with this checkmate is you have a queen and a rook, and you just, you know, do this little shuffling pattern, kind of like a triangle-ish almost, and you just keep pushing them down, very similar to ladder mate that we'll look at later, where you just keep pushing them further back, and then you finally deliver a checkmate with the rook. Now, it's important that it's the rook here, you know, taking away these key squares, and then the queen is controlling the rest, because it doesn't work if it's the other way around. If we have it the queen go around, right, then of course you would just be giving up your queen. You would just take the queen. So it's really important that the rook is the piece delivering checkmate, and it's the queen defending the rook. So that's kind of a nice, you know, little motif to know. It sounds obvious sometimes when you spell these things out, but with these checkmate patterns, it's really important to learn these and kind of internalize them, because the more that you see these maybe like underworkings of the checkmate, once you really start understanding why these checkmates work the way they do, it's a lot easier to come up with other checkmates in games if it's a similar thing, similar pattern, similar checkmate, or even a checkmate that's not named, but it's got the similar configurations of it. You're much more likely to find it because you can piece together the clues, and much more likely to find a checkmate like this killbox mate. So let's keep going. Go to the next checkmate. So this one I've heard as the kiss of death mate. For this checkmate, you just have the queen immediately in front of the enemy king, and this is that checkmate. Some people like to call this queen mate. I don't really like the name queen mate as much because that sounds like any move that's a checkmate and it's with the queen. That sounds to me like a queen checkmate, right? Like imagine if we had the queen on d2 and we just move it to h2. Well, that would be a box mate, but that would be with the queen. One could also say that's a queen mate because that's some kind of queen checkmate. But here, you know, I think this is more descriptive, right? Because this is only for this exact configuration where the queen, defended by your king in opposition, is, you know, attacking their king, and the king has no legal squares to move, so that ends the game. So I think this one's a little bit more descriptive to say this exact checkmate, in this case, the kiss of death checkmate, because, you know, of course, you know, other queen moves could also be checkmate too. So next we have ladder mate, which I referenced earlier. Some people call this lawnmower mate, because what ends up happening is, you know, it's with the two rooks, but it could be queen and rook, could be two queens. But the idea is it's this pattern where you kind of move the rook here, you move this rook here, and you slowly kind of creep up the board one file or one rank at a time. And it's kind of like a lawnmower, how you're cutting the grass, you kind of go back and forth, you know, don't want to miss a spot. Or it's sort of like a ladder, where if you're climbing a ladder, you imagine that you put your hand here, then you put your next hand here, you put your next hand here, and you kind of do that up the board. And that's where this checkmate gets its name from. So ladder mate, you know, you just keep restricting the enemy king one file or one rank at a time, and you move your rooks or queens, you know, up the board in that configuration. Okay, so now this checkmate here. So this one is called Lolli's Mate, not Lolli's Mate. That's kind of a funny thing. Little Freudian slip type sounding. I made that mistake a long time ago, years ago. It was a bit of an embarrassing moment. I was at a chess tournament trying to impress people in the analysis and accidentally said it was Lolli's mate, said Lolli's mate. Yes, I like anime, but I didn't want them to find out in that way. They didn't have to do me dirty that way. But okay, so that is this checkmate. Now, what's important about this checkmate, joking aside, back to the actual configuration here. This is when you have a friendly pawn that is, working with your queen to deliver the checkmate right in front of the king. Now, the reason this is important is almost always the enemy king is castled and Fee and shadows their bishop sometime in the middle game, and then they lose that bishop. Maybe the bishop is traded off for your bishop or something. And the problem is they have a lot of weak squares here. And in this case, because they lack a dark squared bishop, black is really struggling on the dark squares. They would really love to have this bishop still here if it wasn't for this pawn. So what ends up happening is because they have weak dark squares, you can move your queen in, something like this, and now notice their king is cut off, right? They have their own pawns here, so they can't move into their own force. Can't go here because our pawn, and this square is cut off by your queen. So really, their king is kind of corralled to these two squares, in this case G8 and H8. And so the king is so heavily restricted, stuck in this mating net. But notice, if this king was on H8, it would still be checkmate with queen G7. So either place, they're stuck to these two squares, and both of them result in checkmate when the queen is right in front. So that's kind of a highlighting idea where you really don't want to give up your bishop when you're Fee and shadowed, because you might suffer some square weaknesses and might run into something like this Lolli's mate. Okay, so now to the next checkmate pattern here. So this checkmate pattern is called Max Lange's mate. Max Lange was a famous chess player. Obviously, he studied something that came up with this checkmate, or somehow got his name associated with it. I actually like to think of this as Kasparov's mate. I know it's not called that. It's called Max Lange's mate. But I first learned this from Kasparov because I saw Kasparov do it in a game, and I just thought it was such a cool pattern. And the reason it was cool is because if we go back a bit, it's a bit counterintuitive how this almost always comes up. So the pattern that I've seen here is you actually give a check with the bishop, right? Like in this case, it would, it looks like you would play queen here, and it looks like it'd be some kind of battery for checkmate. But the problem is their king escapes because our queen is no longer guarding that square. And so that's not actually a checkmate. So what we have to do is we deliver a check with the bishop, a bit counterintuitive. And this square the king cannot escape to because our queen defends that square. And so what ends up happening is they are forced to the H8 square. And when they're forced there, well, now we give it a discovered check with our bishop. Now the bishop starts defending this square. And so the king is forced over. And so when the king is forced over, now we have this queen for checkmate. So that was a nice little pattern that, a little configuration there. So that pattern there is called Max Lange's checkmate. Okay, so next one. And this one here is called Mayet's Mate. Mayet's Mate. Kind of a tongue twister there with the two M's. Anyway, it's very similar in Lolli's mate, how you have so many square weaknesses because they probably lost their Fee and shadow bishop. They would much rather have their dark square bishop here. Like in this case, black actually has their bishop on the board, but they would much rather prefer it way back here where it can help defend their king. So what ends up happening is they have so many weak squares, and so if like we go back here, like in this case, if we look, all this diagonal is controlled by our bishop. And almost always they're restricted, by their own pawns or a rook because they usually castle into this problem. And so notice with these squares taken away, if we have a queen or a rook on this file, we can control the last squares, and a queen or rook on, in the corner would also give a check to this king, and that will be checkmate. So this is exactly what this checkmate is. So that's that nice configuration. It's also worth noting that even if their rook was not here, this checkmate still works because the rook or queen from the corner is actually covering all of this rank. So that's kind of a nice little pattern to visually know. So next we'll take a look at the next checkmate pattern. So next we have Smothered Mate. So Smothered Mate here is where you give a lone checkmate with just your knight, and their enemy king is actually restricted by all of their friendly pieces, and they have no escape square, so you only have to deliver check, and this is with the knight. Now, almost always, there's actually a really nice pattern, so I'll go back and show a few moves, where almost always this knight move comes up by itself, because it's very rare that the opponent will bury their own king back here, in the corner right behind all their friendly pieces and then just willingly walk into any kind of knight here on the edge, for some kind of checkmate. It's very unlikely that's going to happen. So what ends up happening is you end up forcing this. Go back a few moves here and show. There's a nice little pattern where almost always their king is in the corner. This looks a lot more realistic, because it looks like they're not quite cut off. But very similar to Greco's mate we looked at, this key square is controlled by one of our pieces on this diagonal. So now, almost always there's the rook here, and we give a check with the knight. And so now this check, what ends up happening is, if they know this checkmate is coming, you probably want to sacrifice your rook. It's not great, you lose material, but at least you're not getting checkmated. You move on and you survive. However, when you don't know this checkmate, or when there's no rook here, able to, take this knight, what happens is the king is forced to one legal square, in this case G1. And so that king is forced over. But now we have this really cool idea where we play this knight check to H3. But this is a double check because our piece on the diagonal and the knight here both give check. And so you don't have time to capture this knight because the queen is, attacking the king. And you don't have time to block the queen, like rook to F2 here, because, well, the king is still in check, in this case from the knight. So you can't block both. You have to move your king. It's the only legal move. And so your king is forced into the corner. But now here comes a really surprising shot. The surprising move is you sacrifice your queen. You play queen to G1. And notice the king cannot recapture because it is defended by your knight. And so they are forced to recapture with their rook. But now when they recapture, your knight comes back, and all by itself, the only knight standing is the one to deliver checkmate. So that's the common pattern with the Smothered Mate. Let's go to a very similar one, which some people actually consider the same thing. I like to think it's a little bit different. It's a bit more of a rare version of this. So here we have also Smothered Mate, which I also consider it that. But this one I think is almost like its own thing, because Smothered Mate almost always happens in the corner. But as we notice, their king is not in the corner. Their king is actually on the side, side of the board. It's not like right in the corner of the board. And so this is much more rare. But again, it's surrounded by all of its friendly pieces, and it's delivered check by our knight. So how does this thing actually set up? Well, if we go back a few moves, what ended up happening in this game was I played a really nice idea. I played knight to B8 check, and I noticed that their king can't go over because this would be a checkmate. I just moved my queen right in front, and it's defended by the knight, so that's no good for the opponent. So they're going to have to move to the side here. But now we get this really nice idea where it's very similar to the checkmate in the corner. We can almost act like this is the corner of the board, and the same pattern applies. One reason why pattern recognition is so important, you can recognize the same ideas in similar positions. So here their king is forced over, and just like before, if you imagine it was the corner of the board, we give this check. And so the knight and queen both give a double check. So they can't capture one of ours. They can't block with one of them. They have to move their king. And so when they move their king back to the corner, now we sacrifice our queen with queen to the back rank, in this case queen to E8 check. They recapture. And now we have queen to D7. So this is a nice checkmate. Really cool pattern. I think it's much more rare to get the Smothered Mate on the side of the board, not the very corner, but it is possible, as we've just seen here. So the next one, a lot of people also think this is Smothered Mate. I actually consider this a different pattern called Suffocation Mate, because when we play the knight here, this square isn't really one of their friendly pieces. If it was a friendly piece, we'd all agree this is a Smothered Mate. But because the escape square has, is here for a king, it's not quite smothering. So I would call this Suffocation Mate because the knight is giving this check, and the knight is also controlling the square that they would need to escape to. Now, some people will actually disagree with me, and they'll say that you actually need a bishop on this diagonal controlling this square for that to be considered Suffocation Mate. I think as long as you have any of your own pieces, whether it be a bishop or a queen or anything that you have controlling the square, even if it's the same knight that is giving the check, I would still consider it that checkmate. So I consider that for this one. And now let's go to the next one. So the next one here, very similar to the last one, where it can be slightly controversial with the naming. Where this one, I would consider what's called Swallow's Tail Mate. Now, it's not really the traditional version of this. It's very, very similar to Epaulette's Mate. If you imagine, like, all this was gone, and it was like the edge of the board, and say the king was on the very edge here, well, these pawns almost resemble the Epaulettes, kind of like the two rooks that we looked at before. Now, it's a little bit different here, though, because they do have this back rank that they can flee to. So with Swallow's Tail's Mate, it's these two squares are actually controlled by one of their friendly forces. In this case, the white king has 2 white pieces on those squares, and so its own forces are getting in the way, and so you kind of have this epaulette type pattern, and then these squares are controlled by one of their own friendly pieces. And then when you put your queen in front, this is called Swallow's Tail Mate. Now, the thing is, and this is very similar to the last checkmate that we looked at, Suffocation Mate or Smothered Mate. Some of these become a little bit kind of nitpicky on what exactly defines that checkmate. Because I think in the very, very traditional way, you would think that for Swallow's Tail's Mate, you would have your friendly pieces here. These pawns would not be there. And then you would have like the queen on e3 defended by something like a rook or a bishop, or, something like a bishop here from the distance. And then these key squares where the queen and bishop are, these ones here, these would be defended by, their own friendly forces. So the key to this pattern is to see that the queen is giving check, and then kind of in this diagonalish pattern, they have friendly pieces in those squares. So that is Swallow's Tail's Mate. But the reason this is a bit nitpicky is you start wondering, well, is this actually Swallow's Mate? Or is this some kind of Epaulette's Mate? Because we got this here, and then you could argue that these pieces just defend the escape squares, but it's actually a different type of checkmate. So that brings me to a slight tangent, which is definitely relevant and planned into this video, which is some people like to get really fixated on the names, and other people just like to say, well, it's checkmate. And, I think there's a little bit of a balance there, because I think just saying it's checkmate is kind of dismissive of all of these patterns that are named and the value that you have in saying this is a certain checkmate pattern and it has a name for it. I can describe it to other people and others know relatively exactly what I'm saying. Now, in the case here, with this, does it really matter what kind of checkmate it's titled? I don't think the name matters particularly a lot. I think what matters more is you recognize the elements to it, you recognize the patterns behind this. In this case, that these squares are controlled by their friendly forces, and that you can actually give a checkmate here by putting your queen in front. So whether you call it Epaulette's Mate or Swallow's Tail's Mate or anything in between, I think it's much more important with all these checkmates really, that you understand the key ideas behind it, and if you know the names for them, even better. But I don't think it's really the utmost importance for you to have. But okay, now that I've got that slight tangent out of the way, now I wanted to show something a little bit more unlikely, let's say, but also still very important. So next we have 2 bishops checkmate, which I'm not going to show the entire technique here. I actually did a chess video on that, where you can take a look at that. So this is a common, endgame, and I think it's a really good one to learn if you're kind of intermediate level, but you're definitely past the beginner checkmate and beginner theoretical endgame stage, because this checkmate, it doesn't come up too often in a game. And, notice these bishops could be anywhere along this diagonal, but you can actually force this. If you have just 2 bishops, you can force this checkmate, which is why it's a theoretical endgame. Now, it takes a lot of technique, so you'll have to learn this. And to be fair, it comes up fairly rare in a game, but it's a big confidence boost if you only have 2 bishops and you can deliver a checkmate. So this is 2 bishops checkmate. Next, very similar, but perhaps even more unlikely, is a bishop and knight. Very tricky endgame. I also have a video on that topic as well. You can check that out if you like. This is another endgame which most people do not teach because they feel this is a really advanced one. And to be fair, it is. A lot of title players have actually messed this up, either under time pressure or because they've studied it many years ago and they actually forgot the technique for it. But either way, it's a checkmate, and I think it's worth knowing, because wouldn't you rather know it than not know it? Now, people make the argument your time is better spent studying other things, and although I think there's some merit to that, I actually like to, learn it at least once, even if you don't learn it super well, kind of learn the main ideas, because even if this checkmate never comes up in your games, I've gotten it a few times, but even if it never comes up for you, at least knowing how to do it, it really teaches you some other valuable skills. In the case of this endgame, there's so few pieces on the board, you really have to work together and coordinate all of your pieces extremely well to try and checkmate their king. Otherwise, their king is just going to flee all over the board. So what you have to do is learn the technique. But in doing so, you're really learning how to coordinate your pieces. And piece coordination is something that you can really, be put to use at any stage of the game, especially the tricky middle game. So I think that even though the checkmate is very unlikely to happen, it teaches you valuable skills that might actually be transferable to other games that are much more likely to come up. Okay, so with that being said, I want to show another kind of funny thing. This is not like a name pattern, but you can checkmate with the lone king, even though it's not a castling checkmate. So here, this is just one example where I've moved my king for a discovered check, And this bishop, since the king moved out of the way, you can see by the yellow thing there, my king was here. I moved it out of the way. And this is actually checkmate because my king is controlling this square. And they have a friendly pawn blocking here. Sort of like a backwards dovetail mate if you really look at it. And so we have this bishop attacking their king. And the rook defends all the rest. And finally, our rook that was doing all this work was defended by our own bishop. So that's kind of a cool idea. Because this isn't named, it's just like a lone king move. Maybe people would call it like a discovered checkmate. I'm not really sure. Put in the YouTube comments what you think this should be called. Maybe if I had to name it, I would maybe call it the Killer King Checkmate. Because on chess.com, you actually get an achievement if you can pull off a checkmate by moving your king, as the final move. So that's kind of a cool thing. And then very similarly, I just want to show another checkmate pattern that really doesn't come up too much at all. But this is 2 knights mate. Now, the reason I'm not going to go over this is because if it was only the 2 knights here, this is actually impossible to force. If you have your king, they have their king, and we have 2 knights, and everything else is off the board. So if these pawns were gone and this knight was gone, this is actually impossible to checkmate here. And very, very complicated stuff would be if they had a pawn in certain positions, and then their friendly pawn actually kind of gets in the way of their king. That could also be forced, but only under very, very rare circumstances. That one isn't really worth learning in my opinion. But here, it is kind of cool that, in this case, my pawn is controlling this square, and I actually got checkmate with 2 knights here. So that's kind of neat. So, I hope all this was kind of beneficial for most people. My goal here was to really show off a bunch of chess patterns, just to kind of give most people, especially beginners, a bit more exposure to a bunch of different checkmate ideas. And once you have so many more ideas in your subconscious pattern recognition, you're much more likely to find those checkmates and very similar checkmate patterns in your games. And with that, you're much more likely to win games, because of course you can find that checkmate and play it. Well, that ends the game, and you've just won the game with checkmate. And to that, congratulations, you've won the game. So, I hope that helps everyone. And so with that being said, I will see you in the next chess video.